Our political analyst Lukhona Mnguni joins us for a discussion on the NPA's announcement. Good evening, Lukhona, and thanks for your time. We're seeing there Mmusi Maimane already celebrating, of course, this decision, and I imagine that it has earned the DA quite some mileage in terms of going into 2019.
Good evening, Kathy. I'm not so sure if it will earn them the necessary mileage per se. And that's because of how we approach politics as a country, but also as a people. It was a good road traveled by the DA over the last 8 years and 11 months to get us where we are. And they needed this as their rallying call in two elections, the 2009 general election and the 2014 general election. It sort of crystallized the message around Jacob Zuma, but also they were not just paying lip service to their concerns about then President Jacob Zuma being allegedly corrupt. They actually took it in action and went to the courts and fought a battle that some people may have given up on. However, Kathy, I think there are many more things that the DA still has to do. They are still on their own self-destruct mode when you look at issues around Patricia de Lille, when you look at how Mmusi has been accused of conflating party and state in handling the water crisis in the Western Cape. And of course, they've got an upcoming conference next month that could lead to massive internal political battles and divisions. So yes, this is good. It should find resonance with society, and I think society, by far and large, must applaud the Democratic Alliance for traveling this very long road. Because even those people who are opposed to the DA, some of them are celebrating today. Even those that were within the ANC and couldn't act in the face of a dominant faction that was busy supporting and enabling President Zuma to thrive, they were pinning their hopes on the Democratic Alliance. We know it's been a highly expensive road to travel, and I think it's also an indication of something that's probably going to need a conversation about how at times justice is expensive. I know from the state side of things there's been a disclosure by the president on how much has been spent thus far. I think it's also important for the DA to disclose how it has been able to fund this particular litigation against the president throughout this time, for purposes of transparency, of course, but also just for purposes of public accountability, because this is quite an important case for the country.
And those are certainly important points that you raised there around transparency of that particular funding. It's also the first time in democratic South Africa that we have a former head of state that is now facing criminal charges and having to go through the legal system. What should our expectations be in terms of the political significance of this moment?
Well, Kathy, if we were to talk about the political significance of this moment, it would be to say what a moment it is in terms of affirming the rule of law and the Constitution, that all are equal before the law. There are no deals that can be cut on behalf of individuals to make them avoid prosecution for wrongdoing. It is important to also say that when President Zuma first faced charges, he was a former deputy president, and that was a first. Again, he's now a former president, and it is a first. But when you talk about the political moment, Kathy, I think it's important for us to trace where we come from. There have been so many casualties because of these particular charges. There's been so much compromise in terms of our accountability mechanisms. I mean, someone tried to do what the DA has done, give Mr. Jacob Zuma his day in court, and that's when former President Thabo Mbeki dismissed him from his cabinet as deputy president. But people took advantage of that moment and opportunistically placed us where we are today within the ANC, rallied around the president, compromised principle over their own interests of patronage networks that needed to be centered and take over the ANC. And then, of course, after that Polokwane moment, what you had was again a brains trust team that was put together of individuals that have been named. And I think, Kathy, one of the things we need to ask for is complete accountability, because then President Zuma couldn't have on his own acted in a way that has impugned and maligned our democracy in the way that it has been. He was enabled by certain individuals. When the spy tapes were leaked, Minister Lindiwe Sisulu was Minister of Intelligence in the interim cabinet of Kgalema Motlanthe. She was said to be acting with other persons like Paul Ngobeni, Sipho Siepe, even Matthew Sposa, Kgalema Motlanthe, and they were brains trust of the ANC to try and help President Zuma then escape the charges. And then you had Mukodedi Mshe. How must Mshe now take responsibility? I have seen that he still stands by his decision, but how can you stand by a decision that has been decimated in a court of law to have been irrational? So he's standing on the side of irrationality, and how do we hold him accountable for having taken us here? So there are many political actors, Kathy, that have undermined our institutions for us to be here, and I think it's important that we do so in terms of holding them accountable. Lastly, even judges have been implicated because of this case. How can we forget Judge Hlophe being accused of trying to unruly influence Justice Chris Jafta and Justice Besin Kabinde? And that case into the misconduct of Judge Hlophe has not concluded from the JSC, and Judge Hlophe continues to sit on the bench, and the other two justices continue to sit on the bench. So the picture I'm trying to paint, Kathy, is to say so many institutions have been touched and compromised, to journalists who took sides because of this case, believing that President Zuma was indeed a victim, academics, commentators. So we need far greater cleansing than just seeing President Zuma in the dock. How do we ensure something of this nature doesn't happen again?
And just on that point then, who can Jacob Zuma rely on going into this process? I mean, you're specifically in KZN, and he has been known to have a loyal constituency there. Will those people still be available for him to rely on? And if not, who else might be holding his hand through this?
Well, President Zuma generally holds his own hand through things. He just uses people around him to use them as front men and women and all of that, and also to paint a picture of this highly popular leader that is loved. Kathy, I heard your conversation a bit with Prince Mashele, and I must agree to an extent that there are no dividends to support former President Zuma now, because he's not in power and the promise of power is absent. What might be a motivator for people to rally behind him is that maybe they will use it to regroup as a province of KwaZulu-Natal, for a particular faction to keep some sense of unity and coherency and exert its hegemony in the province. But I think on this one, because what you are effectively asking, is there a section of the ANC that is going to be seen as supporting former President Zuma in his court bids? And what then does that mean for the image of the ANC at a broad context? Well, the ANC has not assisted itself by including former President Zuma in its campaign trail. What is going to happen now? Is he going to go appear in court and then come back after that and campaign for the ANC? So the ANC cannot in actual fact avoid the imminent question that faces the National Executive Committee of the party to say they must take a political decision on this, and they must send a message even to the structures of KZN insofar as ANC members supporting President Zuma, whether they are allowed or not to support the former president. And if they are not allowed, what then does it mean for the threat of some form of divisions in KZN, some form of actually being defiant to the message from the national leadership? So these are the massive political questions. But I think, Kathy, if the NEC avoids taking a decision on this, they will actually be putting themselves on the back foot.
All right. That was, of course, a political analyst, Lukhona Mnguni. Thank you for your time on Newsnight.